All right. Thank you all for joining us today. We have a special session, our first time that self-proclaimed graduate student Michael Keating is here to share the token communities workshop setting with the Arweave adaptive interactive token incentives that they have as kind of a backdrop for exploring tokens in general. And it'll be hopefully a time that we can unveil some of the frameworks that we've been using to explore token communities, and alongside Ruben and Michael and hopefully some people who have gotten to do some of the pre-reading, we can explore Arweave as a means of exploring any token. So maybe that's enough for me. I'll pass it to Michael for a bit of context on where this comes from and where he hopes this goes today. And then we have Ruben and team as well, if we'd like to pass the mic to them before getting going.
Hi, folks. Welcome to the first tokenomics study group of Block 5. I'm Michael Keating. I created these tokenomics study groups in the last block to supplement the great content and guidance that the folks from IDEO collab, such as Ruben and Joe, were providing in that guild. And we've made it a part of the regularly scheduled Token Communities Guild for this block. One of the things that's different about Tokenomics Study Group relative to other sessions at Kernel is that we want to go a level deeper into a token economy and a token community than maybe we could go in a more sort of introductory, sort of more passive sort of fireside chat or kind of lecture format. So we want folks to engage. There's definitely less than 1,000 tokenomics experts in the whole world. I am not one of them. So we're here to teach each other about this token and to help each other learn by helping each other teach each other. And so it's a participatory session. That said, anyone is welcome to be here. If you just want to hang out and listen and absorb the conversation, you're welcome to do so. Just turn your camera off and stay on mute. And if you are here to participate, which we hope you are, because we need your help to learn about this token, leave your camera on, and I might actually call on you to ask you to help explain something about this to us so that we can all figure it out. There was a bunch of pre-reading. We didn't expect anyone to do all of it, but we would hope that folks who are participating in the conversation have quickly looked at the Arweave website, maybe read a little bit of the white paper, watched one or two of the videos, and just feel like you already know the basic. And we'll start with that, but we want to quickly see if we can get into some of the more advanced stuff about Arweave, and there is advanced stuff to get into. So Ruben, do you want to add anything? I don't know if Joe is here also, but you want to add anything to that?
No, thanks, Michael. Thanks for leading. You're the professor for this session, and we're all the TAs to help support you. So yeah, thank you for preparing, and I'm excited to dive in.
Bueno, I'm going to share my screen. Let me just drop into the chat the Figma one more time. One of the things we use in these sessions is an evolving. Oh, here, Joe is here as well. Hey, Joe, do you want to add anything for the group? Joe from IDEO?
Just saying hi. This is going to be fun.
All right. If for those of you who are new to the group, Joe and Ruben are from IDEO Collab. IDEO Collab has actually been building and investing in Web3 blockchain since 2015, which makes them real OGs. So we're very lucky to have them, and I'm looking forward to their help figuring out Arweave. I can see a lot of you are in the Figma. I'm going to share my screen anyway, and Let's see. This actually doesn't make it very easy for me to tell which screen I'm looking at. So maybe I won't. Hold on. Well, let's if anybody else wants to share their screen, share the Figma, they're welcome to. What I thought, this Figma is just a whole bunch of questions that we can ask about a token. That it's a way of thinking about a token economy or a token community, and everything from details like what's its market cap to like more abstract things like what's its meme, or like how does the flow of tokens work through its ecosystem, or why is it important, like why do we care, and so all those questions are laid out for us. But I thought we could maybe begin. Does anybody just want to start by telling us what's so great about Arweave? Like why do we care? Is that what is special about this this protocol? Like what are they trying to do in the world? Anybody want to take a shot at that? Dom, do you want to give it a shot? I'm gonna start cold calling people, and if you you don't want to be cold called, you can turn your camera off.
I'm happy to give it a shot. It appears to me that what makes Arweave special is that they have created the initial conditions of incentives that leave evolution of sort of like node behavior and participant behavior sort of out of the hands of like intentional changes to the tokenomics by like a governance process, and it's more sort of open-ended in allowing each node or player to choose their own strategy in a way that would make the protocol responsive to external pressures and like the evolving needs of the network, but guides behavior towards a type of stability to provide the service that Arweave's designed to provide long term. So from my reading, it seemed like what is special about Arweave is it seems like they've almost stepped one step back from a more rigid incentive design to sort of like just setting the initial conditions and then letting people play in a way that makes sense for them.
That was amazing. And actually, in my view, I think you sort of skipped to the most actually interesting and kind of advanced aspect of Arweave's tokenomics. Other people may disagree. So maybe I actually kind of want to put a pin in that, and despite my saying like, oh, everyone should already know the basics, I think someone should just tell us like, what is Arweave trying to accomplish? Like, what's their purpose in the world? And anyone can put their hand up. Marlon.
Good answer that as well from Sam, but Marlon, please go ahead.
Yeah, what I think is like directly tackle the problem of how to tokenize the crowd knowledge production in a way that is sustainable. Create a very kind of direct relationship between knowledge production and token economy. And as a first, that's what I perceive. And they have several algorithmic propositions in relationship to that.
I'm sorry, I missed Sam's comment. I'll just give you guys a heads up. I don't watch the chat in Zoom. I find it too hard to look at the Figma and look at your faces and look at the chat. So if you're putting something in the chat, hopefully Vivek will see it. Cynthia.
What Arweave is, one of the videos was describing it as a permanent information storage system, which simplifies all of the complexities of a blockchain and makes it so that you can just store a piece of data for an exceedingly long period of time with high degrees of security and no issue. So that's where the adaptive agents come in. So you can actually foresee like hundreds of years in which the network will adapt to the pro-social behavior in a way that the data is permanently stored. That's how I got it.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Permanent storage. that's actually kind of where I wanted to start. It was like permanent is a long time, and like how do you achieve permanence? And so this is tokenomics. And so one of the things I think we can get into the practicalities of like what is storage and of data and like how does that actually work. But there's also there's kind of, because we're talking about tokenomics, there's a kind of a game theory aspect of it. And so I'm curious, does anybody want to like talk about like how that's even possible and like why a token economy, like why this should be done as a blockchain and like with token incentives to achieve this permanence, this permanence of storage, or even why permanent storage is important. All right, I'll try the chat.
It's like Cynthia's got her hand raised.
Oh, and Cynthia's hand's back up. Sorry, this is why I can't look at two things at once. Go, Cynthia.
That might be a legacy.
I didn't put it down, actually, I just realized. The permanent storage, I think they were just saying that in IPFS or in other systems, there may not be, in some cases, the nodes can, like the data could not be permanent if the nodes didn't have an incentive to continue storing the data. There was actually like a IPFS versus Arweave that I can drop in the chat afterwards. But one of the main things is that they also give a reward for nodes that have a bias towards a pro-social behavior that may be emerging. So there is something that just continues to propagate the node beneficial behavior to the network. I don't know if that answered your question.
I think it gets there. Yeah, it's like that actually ties back to Dom's point, which ties into, I think, what was the most recent video with Andy and Sam, which is this idea of this adaptive incentive structure. Oh, Juan, you tell us. You're on mute. Still on mute. Juan, we'll come back to you when you figure it, when your mute is sorted.
He can talk with my mic.
Oh,
Okay.
that's right. You guys are together.
Yeah, it's kind of complex when there are two, because we get echoes and stuff. Yeah, what I want to say, it's like from a very high point of view, it seems to be an endowment model where you pay upfront a big quantity, and then they generate interest from that for eternity and keeping the principal untouched. Also taking into account the fact that data storage becomes cheaper and cheaper every year. So they sort of model that in a very long term.
So can I just ask then, like, is Arweave just Ruben, jump in. I was going to be polemical, but I can save it for a second.
Oh, I was just going to zoom right out and think about like some of the use cases for blockchains and why they're important, and just kind of draw parallels or analogies between, you know, traditional blockchains where they keep a record of all the transactions and the addresses and balances. You can think of file storage as just another extension of this kind of decentralized ledger, which will let anyone store any kind of arbitrary files in a decentralized and permanent way, in a similar way to the way that all the transactions on Bitcoin or Ethereum are immutable, permanent, and public. So I think there's, you can just think of it as like a natural extension of the characteristics of decentralized blockchains applied to a different use case for file storage.
I would like to say that is one of the first time that I start reading the word archiving. So instead of just ledger, so there is something quite important about the potential, the huge potential for from library science to knowledge production and universities, and literally a fully decentralized Wikipedia kind of thing with internet archives together or something like that. Anyway, content.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. Is if you think about who the stakeholders for this are, it seems like the early adopters are Web3 app developers who want their application to be available all the time, forever, and like be able to make that claim to their communities. So through the lens of public good, like that's pretty interesting to know that you're creating a protocol that's community owned and has some sort of permanence or perpetual kind of operations. And so if you can guarantee that, that's a very differentiated value proposition.
Yeah. This perpetuity thing seems to be like a characteristic, and then the ownerless or otherwise anyone can contribute nature. So I got this from the Arweave website on describing the permaweb, but both of those two things, the blockchain-like structure and this mining system that maybe we'll get into in deeper, is one part, and then this sustainable endowment that I think maybe Marlon or maybe somebody else brought up, I find to be really compelling, because even the word endowment seems to give the sense that it's there for the benefit of the memory of the internet into perpetuity, and the economics, when you look into that endowment and how it is set up, is compelling to say, well, okay, if people are going to use Arweave, this endowment is going to grow. They don't need to use it, but they could towards public benefit, and are structured in a way that they can do that in ways that maybe companies couldn't, to answer the question, Michael, of maybe why Web3 in this case.
That's great. When I first heard of Arweave, I'll offer that I thought it was kind of like a complicated way of getting people to overpay for storage. And I just didn't, and like it's like, what? Okay, so what? But obviously it's much more than that. And like the concept of permanence is hard to do things, for a really long time. And I think that's where in many ways the kind of blockchain mechanics come in. I realize I can't share my screen because this computer I'm using doesn't have permission to do that. I have to restart Zoom in order to do it. So if anybody else would like to share the Figma so that we can look at it, we can do it. But one part of the board where I see a bunch of people hanging around is where we kind of divided up the token into a concept of like sort of its macroeconomics, its microeconomics, and its meme, which is just an abstraction, but there's an aspect of this, the microeconomics, which are just sort of like, how does this thing actually work as a business? And it turns out that like I think just maybe just skip past this stuff, because I assume most people read it, that like apparently the cost of storage is declining in the world and has been for a very long time, even before computers. And so money that you put down today for storage is like, you can put down a relatively small amount of money today and it will fund the storage or something for a very long time. And that's just surprising to me that I didn't actually realize that that storage was so cheap, and particularly if you're trying to think about it in a permanent way. And that's where that endowment structure comes in. And that's kind of part of, I think, how you can sort of think of the microeconomics of Arweave is like, well, actually storage is getting cheaper. So the idea of like permanent storage, at least from like the cost of the bits, is actually doable economically. But then there's a lot of other stuff that goes into permanence that isn't just about having a bit where your stuff can be stored. So one question maybe to kind of move things along is like, I actually don't know the answer to this, but I have a vague idea. Can anybody explain how Arweave is mined? Like how it's earned? Like what is that activity in the Arweave network? Does anybody want to jump in on that? No, can I cold call somebody? People are
Okay, I
shaking,
can
Jocelyn
go.
shaking her head. Don't cold call me.
That's a tough one.
How is Are We Mind? Like, what is
Do
the
you hear
word?
me?
Oh, hi, Pauline.
Is there someone who hear me? Yeah, I'm not sure I can answer to the question, but maybe it's linked with the fact that people, every players can describe their own rules, pro-social rules, and if others fit in these pro-social rules, they will give them data. It's with my level in English and my level in Web3, so sorry if it's too.
That sounded right to me, but what are they when they're giving each other? Who are these people? Maybe that's it. Maybe that would help. It's like, who are the people that are doing the giving and rewarding the pro-social behavior? Like, who are these folks, and what is it that they're? Are they people that are storing the data?
Ah, yes.
Sorry, my French is worse than your English, I promise.
Well, I can read from the website. Yeah.
Is it like a proof of space concept?
I
Yes,
think
it
you were
does
saying
have a
anyone
function.
that has space available for storage.
Okay.
So I'm tempted to jump in here. I'm not an expert in this, but I think in the paper you see this when they talk about mining, they talk about the sporas, which I don't remember exactly what the acronym stands for, but effectively that's like creating proof that you're participating to create space, but also to maintain the ledger. And so it seems like there's some interesting mechanisms around when we're talking about pro-social. One of the interesting things is the way they've designed these mechanisms. Pro-social behavior was intended, but also emergent. And so I think that's a really interesting thing to think about, which is pro-social behaviors just naturally emerged because of the way the system works. And the number one way that I started recording some of the mechanisms down here in the tokenomics diagram section. It's not complete, so feel free to add. But the core of the model that they are employing is this idea of optimistic tit for tat, which basically means. And by the way, I watched the video and read the paper, and just like, hopefully this resonates with some of you who are new to the space. Like, some of this language is like impenetrable and super intimidating, and there's math equations, and like, I just want to say, like, that stuff, like, I'm not like, that stuff intimidates me too. So if you feel that way, you're not the only one. So what I was trying to do is not get too lost in all of the kind of like game theory language, computer science language, and math language, and try to abstract it one level up. And so what optimistic tit for tat means basically is you assume that if you share, others will share. And so the way that they've programmed it is you mostly share with those who are sharing with you, but there's a random function where you're choosing to share with somebody else in the network at random. And that's the optimistic part, is then you assume if you randomly share with them, they're going to share back with you. And so what happens is a network emerges out of that sort of construct. And so that's pretty cool. They then have a peer ranking score. So Arweave itself calculates and publishes how they calculate peer ranking to help people decide who they want to share with. But then anybody else can modify that and create their own peer ranking score. And that's where some of the emergent pro-social behavior comes from, which is, let's say Ruben and I realized that, oh, there's a way to manipulate the peer ranking score that Arweave has published, and we're going to look at it differently. And so suddenly we're saying, oh, Greg, just because you're next to me on my screen. Greg is playing this game differently, and therefore I've ranked him either higher or lower because of that. And by open sourcing that or being able to share a variety of peer ranking scores, what you have is an emergent property in the network where you're like constantly getting better at deciding who to share with. And so that's like the core mechanic for how sharing works. I think that plus what we were talking about before, which is this idea of a protocol endowment where you pay up front, are the two defining features of this token system.
And Joe, just to be clear, like all these folks that are optimistically sharing with each other, what are they sharing? The file that I stored on Arweave? Like I want to store a file on Arweave forever. I get now that because the cost of storage is just declining so quickly, I can spend a couple dollars, maybe less, and know that that file will be there forever. But what is it that these folks that are optimistically sharing with each other, what is it that they're sharing? Like, and like, how does that help me know that in 20 years I can come back and find my file?
I think they're sharing, yeah, they're sharing their bandwidth and storage. So, and even this is a side note, but I caught note of this, like they're even incentivizing people to store stuff on IPFS to pin it, which I think that's like another pro-social behavior because they want the whole kind of industry to succeed, which is pretty cool. But I think what you're storing is maybe it's files and flat files. There's the example is like, what if your NFT goes away, right? Because actually your NFT is just a pointer to somewhere else. So this could solve that problem. I think the main and most interesting application of this is what we discussed earlier, which is you can run your apps on top of this, knowing that it's always going to be there. And I think that seems like the killer use case right now of Arweave.
But is it always going to be there because the storage is getting so much cheaper and whatever I paid already covers it? Or is it always going to be there because
that's the theory, right? Is they've got this cost curve and they say that shows that the cost of storage is declining by, I can't remember the real number. I think it's like in the 30 to 40% range year over year. And then they're estimating actually a much more conservative cost reduction in how they charge up front. So that's what creates the endowment. So they're basically creating a buffer, and then the whole system hinges upon a simple kind of game or simple economics, which is like they're going to, whatever the prevailing cost of storage is at that time, they're going to pay a little bit more, right? And so they're assuming economically rational actors will take that offer because it's to their benefit to do so. And so that's the theory behind how you create the perpetual storage. And then somebody was asking in the chat, like, why do they limit themselves to, like, if it's perpetual, why does it end? And at some point, those benefits end. And their theory is, if you get far enough out, storage paradigms will step change, be better and different. And at that point, whatever's on here, they believe you move from an economic design to a social design where people will just say like, hey, this is a public good. We're going to move the entirety of Arweave onto this new, yet unimagined storage system. And they give examples of the past where, like, you know, the entirety of like GeoCities or something from the early web days is a tiny amount of data and very easy to like support. So they're anticipating that, you know, like 100 years from now, I don't know when, that will be true for whatever Arweave is, and it'll just get subsumed by the new storage dynamic. I see Vivek leaning in, and I see.
I just wanted to Greg, if we can, just to continue to get new voices, and then maybe go back to Marlon.
Joe, just maybe like adding on one thing to what you said in the form of a naive question, because it's a point I'm struggling with a little bit. Is there's almost like this notion of like mutual destruction at the end. And what I mean by that is like, at a point, the network effects of Arweave are strong enough and so much is stored on it that when the economic incentives aren't there, that it won't stop because it will harm so many people that are part of the network insofar as like their data and storage going away. And like that perpetuates its permanence. But maybe I get tripped up on that based on the point you just made, which is that if it's relatively small compared to everything else that might exist in 100 years, like, is that paradigm true? Or am I just thinking about this in like completely the wrong angle as a relative new to Arweave?
Does anyone want to, I've been talking a lot. Does anyone want to try to answer that?
I can just have this up on the screen again. I also think it's a good question. The things that are in my mind, Greg, which I might be wrong on, so please somebody call me out if so, but the first claim that's made up front is that you pay once and then it's stored forever. So the hope is that like over the longer time arc, that checks out. That's the graph. I'm not sure exactly where is that in here. That's over here. So your purchasing power increases faster than you spend as the cost of storage decreases over time. Storage purchasing power generated on your initial fee ensures that your data is stored for beyond 200 years. So Greg, I guess that's like starting point one for discussion. And then the second part that my mind is going to, which again is still trying to like piece things together, is the bandwidth game that Joe was talking about, optimistic tit for tat, and the adaptive nature of that. So the hope that even if no one wants to look at that piece of data that was stored for 50 years and no one touches it, but then one day, 50 years from now, a website link is clicked and we need the miners to react. You have this game that incentivizes that they help each other to make that page available as quickly as possible, even over a very long time arc. How much of the question does that answer and how much is left unanswered?
I think that was helpful. And I saw a couple of people in the chat were like, Greg, I don't even know what you were asking. I think I like 60% understand what I'm asking. The part I get tripped up on is like, we talk about permanence, but I want to make sure that I understand the incentives that truly make it permanent. Like if we're going to bank on hundreds of years of storage on this, that I, at least for myself, understand what the economic or social incentives are to truly make that a reality.
Yeah, I think we sort of glossed over the proof of storage, the proof of access, which is pretty important. And it's kind of it's actually simpler than optimistic tit for tat. It's just like there's like, okay, if this were not a blockchain, I could give Greg like $2 to store my file, and like if at some point he let his computer die and my file wasn't stored there, then like I could sue him or something like that for saying that he was going to store my file forever and then not doing it. But like because there's a blockchain, we're supposed to be able to prove that there's supposed to be a game mechanic that demonstrates that this will always be there. And I think Vivek and a couple of other people in the chat cited proof of access, which I actually frankly don't fully understand. I understand the principle of it. I don't actually understand how it works mechanically. But if you're storing data in Arweave, you need to be able to prove that it's accessible. I think on a pretty, or you get paid to prove that it's accessible. That's what I think is what the mining is. And anybody want to add detail to that? And then we can get it. Then actually, optimistic tit for tat. I think of it as like the first order of magnitude. First question is like, how do you do permanent storage? Well, it happens that storage is getting so cheap that it's actually not that hard. Then the second is, how do you prove that what you put into the permanent storage will always be there? That's where the mining and the proof of access comes in. And then the sort of third order, which is the real kind of like, it's a thing that Andy interviews Sam about for an hour in the most recent talk, which is the AIIA optimistic tit for tat, like the emergent, like unscripted as Juan calls it, anarchic kind of like way of like pro-social allocation. That's almost sort of like the third order in my mind of what makes this thing work. So I hope I'm not over framing it for people, but I found it helpful to think about it in terms of like, there's like the cost of storage, then there's like proving that something is available, and that's kind of core mining procedure, and then which is actually where Dom started us off, which is like probably the most unique thing and most sort of intellectually challenging and interesting thing about Arweave is the optimistic different stuff. Sorry, that was a lot. If anybody else wants to take that somewhere or silly.
Cynthia, maybe.
My chat was covering the raised hands.
I just to add one thing. The other thing they mentioned for permanent storage is that the nodes are randomly tested to pull data from what they're storing. So they are actively rewarded for proving that they can actually access the data that they promised to perpetuate. And by giving rewards to the nodes that prove that they have access to the data stored, they have this pro-social behavior of perpetuating the data perpetuating the data, or that's what they claim. But then what Joe was saying is like, if that was not enough, then if at any point in time there was like another competition, then you can just store it in the next future version of storage, which answers some of my questions about perpetuity as well.
It gets back to Dom's point earlier of like how the sort of adaptability of the optimistic tit for tat and the AIIA stuff makes it, again, it's like permanence is a long time. Like how do you create game mechanics that contemplate sort of indefinite time periods? That's like, I think that's why Andy liked to talk to Sam so much, because it's really deep. It's like how do you do that? That's hard. And creating an adaptive this sort of more adaptive system, I think, is part of this, like this idea that like permanence isn't just like there will always be enough bits available. It's that you can assume that over time that the incentives will evolve to meet the new circumstances.
Yeah. Marlon, if you'd like to, and then I
thank you.
In the chat.
Yeah, so there is a interesting thing between the layer that is playing directly in a distributed matter, and then the HTTP aspect of seems like it's superimposed. But I have like this kind of almost like a political concern that is in relationship that if we leave everything to, let's say, emergent properties of economic processes, or economic process in this case as emergent, so the perpetuity is, what I understand, it will be based perhaps in some kind of interests. So then, I think that I worry about kind of some kind of top-down actions that are done, let's say, by museums, or to, for example, try to protect some kinds of knowledge from disappearing. What I'm trying to say is just like, wow, how much would be bottom-up and top-down that we can actually strategically preserve aspects of cultural production that they are not from the majority. For example, there are many interests of how to change history and facts, right? So anyway, so I feel like there is something interesting there to how to balance those forces, kind of top down and the bottom up of community.
It's true. And it reminds me of a question in the chat earlier from Durya about the right to be forgotten. Not exactly related, Marlon, but also within the same category of questions of how to
prove your existence or your right of be forgotten, how to not be deleted.
Yeah, super interesting questions on those aspects, Vivek. I think that it's interesting because we see the law clashing with blockchain technology in a few fronts, and this is one of them. That these laws, privacy and the right to be forgotten, and obviously content moderation, are designed in a paradigm where the data is controlled by a central party. And so, how do you actually how does the law adapt to a situation where there is no such admin authority over the data? I don't think anyone's got any great answers right now, but I think it's interesting to think about the permanence of the base layer of the stack here, and then think about some of the potential centralized businesses that may be built on top of it, which may have the ability to kind of not change, obviously, the permanent data layer, but kind of change how that is distributed and displayed. I think that's an interesting combination.
Yeah, that might be a really good segue into the one part of the stack that we haven't touched on, which I think is great for the record. And I really appreciate everyone like with 50% confidence or 60% confidence speaking, because on these lower layers of the stack, it gets very murky, but it's really helpful to then be able to say, okay, there's a mining layer. There seems to be this really interesting game theory game on the bandwidth layer. And then there's this endowment that is a financial tool that can be used to support this into perpetuity. There is kind of like the top layer that Ruben just alluded to, that there are for-profit companies that are being built on top of this ecosystem that the Arweave community calls profit-sharing communities. I'm trying to see which of the wikis I have open that can describe this, but let's see, lots of things open. Profit sharing. So the idea is that profit sharing communities are a mechanism for developers to build applications and retain ownership over revenue streams that they can build on top of the permaweb, and that there is some unique characteristics of these. I think they would probably describe these communities kind of like Arweave native DAOs, where there's real-time dividends. If your application is being used, you get paid using these PSTs. They can be traded much more liquidly than, excuse me, like equity in startups. And they feel like there's some interesting governance characteristics for all of these companies that are built on top of the permaweb. So I don't need to go too much further, but I think that rounds out all parts of the stack, at least speaking of them. We've at least touched on each part at this point.
One quick add to that is one of the things that these made me think of is an analog in the NFT space. So Zora, which maybe I don't want to throw Ruben under the bus here, but Ruben helped set up Zora, and like Zora has into their NFTs, this is an analog, so bear with me, but the ability to revenue split it like intrinsically into the NFT itself. And so it feels analogous here, where they've built a function where you can revenue split natively inside of the protocol. And that leads to communities that can then share ownership over specific data sets or applications or what have you.
Yeah. And maybe just because Jocelyn, I think it was a really important question. If you did want to repeat it, or if we could touch on it a little bit, one idea that's being discussed seems to be about like the long time horizon for the endowment here. What is that? How does that play into the future of Arweave, given there's so many new things that can happen over that time frame? Jocelyn, maybe you could help me like put that into words.
Yeah, sure. And I think Joe's sort of semi-answer my question in chat. But I mean, the whole premise of Arweave and why I think it's different is because they've basically looked into the future 200 years from now, sort of like built a model that brings future value into the present, and also has a historical account in terms of permanence of actions on the blockchain. So how does it account for, well, the future is unpredictable. Like, how do you account for changes in the future? Like, I think back 200 years ago, the internet didn't exist. 50 years ago, blockchain wasn't even conceived. And it's hard to imagine that 200 years from now, our conceptualization of data storage will still be the same. Like 50 years from now, it will even be different. And if the entire premise of Arweave is basically this matching of past and future into the present, it just feels like, how do you account for change? Which I know is built in to a certain degree, the emergent nature of behavior. So like, I think that sort of like helps in terms of just like trying to match people's behavior to a moment in time. But what happens if something I can't even hypothesize, because who knows what will happen in terms of data storage? But I think, Joe, you had a really great answer for that in terms of governance vote. But that was basically my question, trying to grapple with what makes Arweave unique. And
And I wanted to add one point to this, and then maybe we can go to Pauline. But like one principle that Ruben also kind of alluded to, but maybe could be stated very clearly, is control as liability in these systems. Like this endowment, you do not want to be the party that is in control of it, and you want it to be something that is publicly managed because of these types of questions, right? Like we can work on a multi-lifetime scale, but if we are going to do that, then the way that we think about these things is much less about control and much more about stewardship. And that to me is like a really interesting reframing if we can do it well. But Pauline, maybe?
Yeah, I was gonna say I think they probably based this on on Moore's law, which has so far proven to continue being accurate. And even if we don't know how it works, it has worked so far. And we could go, I don't know if somebody has analyzed this, but we could go way before the creation of computers and think about storage, I don't know, like thousands of years ago, where only kings or emperors could pay someone to carve, you know, a message in their pyramid or something, and then like only kings would have pay people to copy by hand their books or their messages, etc., and then the printing press, etc. And probably if we analyze that, it follows Moore's law also.
Yeah, that's exactly what I took away from some of the reading, which is there's a core assumption based on Moore's law and the cost of storage specifically that's going down. And so based on that, what they're basically saying is we can design an economic system that fits within this curve that always incentivizes people to have proof of space. And so what I think the 200 years thing is a conservatively long enough time to say that, and by that time, some new like transformational step change in storage will happen, where whatever's stored in Arweave will be minuscule compared to the new technology, and it will just be adopted. More likely than not, that will happen in 50 years, not 200. But I think they're just trying to say, like, let's give ourselves enough of a window for whatever that thing we can't imagine yet is to happen. And then you asked a really interesting question. It's like, what if it happens in like 5 years and they've got this huge endowment? Like, I don't know what would happen in that case. That's a really, they must have, I bet if we look through their docs, there's some sort of kind of like, kind of thought put towards that, because this is a really well thought out system. But I personally don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah. Thank you, folks. One other seed to plant with the group, just because we're talking about Moore's law. I think it'll be so fascinating to see what the DeSci folks have to say about this, because I know that one of the biggest breakthroughs in the biotechnology world in the last 10 years is a company called Illumina, which has really sort of like changed the curve of DNA sequencing. And it has completely smashed any sort of like people's expectations on how you can sequence DNA and the access to technology that it's I'll throw in sort of a quick article in the chat in terms of how this has changed Moore's law. But Illumina is a phenomenal company, but I'll be very curious about folks who are working in design and what they think about this particular tokenomics example, because it does change the time horizon.
Yeah, I see.
I don't have an answer, but
yeah, we have Mike and Alexandra in the chat, who I think are kind of in the DeSci world. I'm trying to keep us in line with the chat. Alexandra, maybe you could share from your background in library science.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Sorry, I'm not turning on my video. And yeah, so coming from library science and archival studies, I have been taught for so long, to preserve and to create access to information, which I really do believe in the creating access to information. And I do think there's a lot of partitioning and a lot of information is hidden, especially in archival practices. It's intimidating to go into an archive if you've never been to one. Even as someone who has studied it, I'm terrified to go into them. So I think there's like these very cool ideas. I think Arweave is really interesting, and I think it would be so cool to see archives and libraries adopt this technology as also a way to fund themselves, because funding is always an issue. So that's like one topic. But the other thing that I'm also always thinking about is what's the point? Do we really learn from preserving all of this? And is it worth our time and effort? Again, because I don't know how much we truly learn. And to what Jocelyn was saying, that we cannot predict the future. We have no idea what the technology is going to look like. We have no idea what natural causes are out there. We can put all that effort into preserving within a physical archive, and then there's either a flood or a fire and it is gone. And on top of that, there are cultures that actively do not preserve. And even when archives and institutions request to preserve that kind of their cultures or their artifacts, or even their oral histories, it's met with a lot of resistance. And I wonder if there's something we could learn from actively not preserving. I have no answers, but I think it's very interesting and something that I'm constantly thinking about.
I really love that. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, wow. There's so many different things to potentially touch on there, but I put a little note for the endowment on, like, could this fund things like libraries, other types of public goods? The idea reminds you back to Daria's question about the right to be forgotten. Adam, the reference from the Sand Fireside, which is those who control the past control the future. Perhaps with no preserving, we remove the control of one perspective. That's interesting. Michael, 7 minutes left. Anything else anyone wants to say in the chat? Burning thoughts to share? Because I know there's a lot in there.
I don't have anything really. I think this is a particularly rich tokenomic study group. So I really appreciate everyone's participation, and Vivek, your facilitation, and it's I think people are really engaged, and we've gotten deeper into this than I expected us to. So I'm really happy with all this, and maybe if we had like 1 minute at the end just to sort of summarize and talk about future sessions before signing off, that's really all I need.
Cool. Yeah. I want to just shout out Cynthia and Greg and anyone who's been adding stuff to this section, and of course Michael for like putting the original framing. Just the color coding and the ability to like click around and add notes as questions came up, I found to be like really interesting learning environment. Yeah, I think this particular section is where we honed in on. I know there's other parts to this that we might use more in future sessions, but just like different parts of the whiteboard that might gain priority depending on how they help us move through and learn together. Open to any other thoughts from people, either on Arweave or on kind of like flow. Maybe we'll try to put out some type of a feedback questionnaire on how this was from like a learning environment perspective, because that's ultimately the intention.
Can I quickly drop in, like maybe for next session, as I was going through this, I realized what we're really thinking about is like, there's the purpose of the protocol or the community. Then there's desired pro-social behaviors inside of it. There's like, and then there's secondary behaviors. And I think maybe starting to like as you're designing token systems for whatever you're working on, I think thinking through like things at that high level of like purpose, desired behaviors, secondary behaviors, and then like, what are the net consequences? I think that can be a high level framework we can start to play with. And maybe we try to do that for the next one of these to unpack there. But don't mean to grab the mic, like really curious to hear from everyone what we can do to make these sessions better.
I shared this with Michael. Sorry, Vivek. I was going to say, I shared this with Michael. I think the pre-reads and prep materials were incredibly helpful. I think particularly for this example, which is, I think, relatively dense compared to maybe some other things that we explore. And so to the extent that we're able to do that before these sessions, I would heavily support that and advocate for it. I think it was super helpful in framing.
Yeah, that's the way we try to do it with these, and we're obviously happy to have people come who didn't have time to prep, but we love it if a bunch of people come prepped, because we definitely get further into the topic if that's the case. So I'm glad that worked out. Joe, I don't know if you want to talk now about there's an idea that this is kind of an evolving template, and sort of apropos your point about considering the purpose and then the pro-social behaviors and secondary effects, and basically as an example of a way of augmenting this framework that you're also at IDEO talking to other groups and who are trying to figure out how to understand token economies and teach other people about token economies. Do you want to say anything about the sort of evolution of this framework and other inputs from IDEO that might get applied to this and where it could go in the future? Is that premature, or do you know what I'm talking about?
I think so. I think the intention for these sessions is to figure out how to help people like you design token economic systems, especially if you're not a hardcore game theory token designer, right? And so what we want to start to build together is a public good of a toolkit that can be, like that we can just launch and share with the world that anybody can use to do this. So I think let's keep refining and making this as valuable to you as possible. And then if it turns out that we have a thing that's worth publishing and sharing openly, let's do it.
Yeah, I'm excited about that. I find this useful, and for anybody who's an entrepreneur, I think every profession probably has sort of toolkits or templates or frameworks. There's something called a business model canvas that other parts of IDEO have been involved in developing. It's very similar to the customer discovery framework for tech startup people, if any of you are in that world. But having a document that can you can either use to analyze another token economy like the one we did today, or as you're thinking about developing your own, you think, well, what would be the second order effects of this token? Like if it's like, what kind of pro-social behaviors am I trying to incentivize with this token? What would be my token's meme? Like it's actually, I'm using it myself. The template that we use in these sessions is a template I use as I am trying to think of develop my own token economy as an entrepreneur. I'll just, as we're getting into the last minute, we have 2 more sessions scheduled for this guild. In 2 weeks, we'll be back with Ruben. Ruben from IDEO is also a lawyer, and he'll be doing a session on legal and regulatory questions, of which there are many, about tokens. That session will not be recorded in order to give the folks that are in the session the opportunity to ask very candid questions. So if you would like to attend that session, please make sure that you can actually attend at the time, which will be this time in 2 weeks. And then 2 weeks after that, we'll do another tokenomics study group, and we'll pick another token, another community, and we'll go through it very much like the one we did today. And we'll give folks an opportunity to weigh in on what that token should be. And in the interim, the template is yours to use. You could grab this and organize your own. If you can't wait another month for the awesomeness that was this tokenomics study group, and you want to grab 5 or 10 people who are particularly interested in some particular token or community, and you want to use this template or use this format to to do a Junto and dive in, please do. And you know, let folks know and if that this tool is for you for all of that. So I think that's it from me. Any Vivek, Ruben, Joe, anyone else, final words?
Just thank you everyone for your participation, and we'll be definitely sending a feedback related survey sometime soon, maybe after one of the next sessions, but thank you for your time.
Thanks everybody.
Okay,
Thanks so much, Michael.
Thanks everyone, really appreciate it.
bye bye.